Welcome to the Bible Savvy Podcast, a weekly conversation about how to understand, enjoy, and apply God's Word. It's time to jump into a new passage from the Bible Savvy reading plan.
Well, hello and welcome to a special bonus episode of the Bible Savvy Podcast. I'm Clayton Keenon, and today we're going to be talking about how to understand, enjoy, and apply the book of Exodus. This is a little different from our normal format where we walk through one passage from the Bible Savvy reading plan and discuss it as a group. Instead, we're going to be getting a big picture orientation to an entire book of the Bible. As a church, we're going to be reading through the Old Testament book of Exodus over the course of the next 5 weeks, and Exodus is an incredibly foundational book in the Bible. It's one of the first 5 books that are sometimes called the Pentateuch or the Torah or the books of Moses. These books are the cornerstone of the Old Testament. And Exodus tells the story of some of the most famous and important events in the Bible, and at the same time, it also has some of the most challenging passages, the sort that make people give up their read through the Bible program. So we're going to talk about these things. Here's the metaphor I like to use in these episodes. We are setting off on an adventure through some wild, breathtaking terrain. We're starting at the trailhead and we're looking ahead at the journey, and we need a seasoned guide, someone who can give us the lay of the land and help us know, how to take the path and where the twists and turns are going to be and the challenging parts, but also the places where you should pause and get the view. And so we've got an expert guide for the book of Exodus today. It's Dr. Carmen Imes. Dr. Imes is the Associate Professor of Old Testament at Biola University. She's the author of 2 of my favorite books about the Old Testament. One is called Bearing God's Name. The other is called Being God's Image. I recommend these books all the time. They are both brilliant, but also accessible to the average person, which makes them perfect for handing out to people. We are going to actually be giving away copies of both of those books to 2 lucky people. If you'd like to be included in the giveaway, you can subscribe to our brand new Bible Savvy YouTube channel. And if you comment on this video and share your biggest takeaway from the interview, you'll be entered into the giveaway. If you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, our YouTube channel is simply at Bible Savvy, and we'll be picking our winners in February when we finish reading the book of Exodus together. Dr. Imes also has some online courses that are worth checking out. Most notably right now for us is a course that she did for the Bible Project on the book of Exodus. She's also currently working on a commentary on Exodus, and I'm really looking forward to that. Dr. Imes and I actually have a personal connection. She was a doctoral student at Wheaton College when I worked there, and when I was planning a grad chapel series, we were going to do a series on the Gospel according to Moses. We were going to do a message on each of the first 5 books of the Bible, and when I got to the book of Numbers, I asked around, and all of the professors begged off of teaching on the book of Numbers, but they said, you know what, Carmen is really great in the Pentateuch, so you should ask her. And I went to her and she said, well, I'm not really a specialist in Numbers, but sure. And to this day, it is the best message I've ever heard on Numbers. Not that I've heard a whole lot, but I learned things from that message that I use every time I teach on Numbers, every time I study Numbers, that really, really helped me. So I'm so glad to have Dr. Imes here with us. Dr. Imes, welcome to the Bible Savvy Podcast.
Well, thank you, Clayton. I have to say right off the bat that your message on the Gospel according to Leviticus is one that I have gone back to again and again. I've played for my students, and every time I teach Leviticus, I think of the ways that you explained it so well, and I use some of the things that you had in your chapel message.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. That's awesome.
It was a great series.
That's awesome. Well, when we do a podcast, we normally like to start with something lighthearted and fun just to get to know each other. So here's my question. Would you rather be able to speak every language or teleport anywhere at any time?
I'd rather be able to teleport, I think.
Why is
I love
that?
languages, but the idea of just being able to show up at Mount Sinai is really great, because I've been trying to get there for about 9 months, and the government won't give us permission to go. And so I would love to show up at Mount Sinai. I'd love to show up and visit a friend somewhere. And so as much as the languages would be cool, I think, showing up to hang out with my parents for the afternoon or, that would just be really cool.
It would be really awesome. I'd probably pick that too. Although, the language is good. Sometimes the journey actually is nice getting somewhere. You realize how far you've gone, but teleportation would be more practical, I think. All right, let's jump into Exodus. Whenever we talk about scripture, we always try to understand it in context. So let's start with kind of big picture context for the book of Exodus. Let's start by situating it in the context of the Bible. Where do these events take place in the big storyline of scripture?
Sure. So if somebody has read the book of Genesis, they are aware that God selects Abraham and his family and promises to give them the land of Canaan as their inheritance, and that they're going to become this great nation, and that's where they're going to live. And what's really interesting about the Torah or Pentateuch is that they barely get to live there at all in the first whole 5 books. And so Exodus is during a long sojourn in Egypt, where the people have left Canaan, because the descendants of Abraham have left Canaan because of a famine, and they end up spending hundreds of years in Egypt and end up being enslaved there, and then God sets them free. So there still has not been receiving the land, having it really be their homeland. They haven't become a nation yet. This is right kind of at the beginning, where they're still figuring out who are we and what does it mean to be the family of God or the people of God.
Yeah, as we read it, what are some of the themes that come through, in this book? It's so foundational in terms of,
It is.
coming right at the beginning of the Bible.
Yeah.
What are the themes that we should look for as we're reading through it?
One of the biggest ones is the revelation of God. So Yahweh, the God of Israel, is revealing who he is to Pharaoh as a kind of showdown where he's saying, "Hey, I'm going to tell you who I am, and then you're going to realize why you have to do what I say." And the whole series between Yahweh and Pharaoh kicks off in chapter, I think it's 7, at the early part of chapter 7, where Pharaoh says, I don't know who Yahweh is, and I don't have to listen to you. Maybe it's 5 when he says that. Oh, yeah, beginning of 5. Pharaoh said, "Who is Yahweh that I should obey him and let Israel go? I don't know Yahweh, and I won't let Israel go." And then that kicks off the series of signs that God gives to Egypt to prove who he is and to prove what kind of power he has. And all the way through, there's this phrase punctuating these signs, "and then you will know that I am Yahweh," or "then Pharaoh will know that I am Yahweh," or "then the Egyptians will know that I'm Yahweh." So I think one of the first things to notice is that it's Yahweh's self-revelation. He is showing us who he is. In chapter 3, he appears to Moses in the burning bush at Mount Sinai, and he tells Moses his name. You're to call me Yahweh. But there's not a clear sense at that point what it means to be Yahweh. And if we want to know who Yahweh is, we have to follow the rest of the narrative. By the end of the book of Exodus, we have a very robust picture of the kind of God that Yahweh is. And we begin to see what sort of claims he's making on the people that he rescued. So he rescues the Israelites from Egypt, but then he turns around and tells them, "Hey, you can't be like the Egyptians. You know what it's like to be enslaved. You know what it's like to be oppressed. Don't do that to other people." And so when the people arrive at Sinai and they get the law, that law is not telling them how to get saved. It's telling them how to live on mission as God's people. And it turns out their behavior is supposed to mimic or reflect God's behavior as a rescuer. And so there's some very stringent laws that protect people from being exploited. So the Israelites are supposed to mimic what they know of Yahweh. So there's the knowing Yahweh and then the serving Yahweh. The people go from serving Pharaoh to serving Yahweh at the end of the book. This is not, sometimes people think of Exodus as the get out of jail free book. Like you just are free and now you can do whatever you want. But that's actually not what the book shows. It's Yahweh is getting the people out of Egypt. They're going from serving Pharaoh to taking on a new master. Yahweh is their new master, and they're now his people. They don't just get to go live their best life. If they want to live their best life, it's going to be in relationship with Yahweh. And so there's the identity and vocation of the people is formed through their relationship with Yahweh, and he makes himself known in all sorts of ways through the book. So those are probably 2 of the biggest themes.
That's really helpful. I like the dynamic between God revealing himself, but then the people also reflecting what God is like. There's you see him and then you're like him. And then they're freed from slavery, but now they're slave servants of the Lord. So I think those parallels are fantastic. Let's dig into the first half of the book. Okay. So this is where all the narrative parts are, all these great stories that happen, the sort of thing that if you watch a Moses movie this is the part, the first half here is what it emphasizes. But let's start with just the situation. Okay. So at the start of the book, the people of Israel are in slavery. What
Mhm.
exactly would that mean? I think we've got lots of different conceptions about slavery that come from lots of different places. What exactly would
Yeah.
it have been like for them in Egypt?
Yeah, so to understand this, we actually have to back up to the book of Genesis. At the end of Genesis, we have Joseph, who's been sold by his brothers as a slave into Egypt. He rises to power through interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, and he gets put second in command of all of Egypt, and he helps the nation endure a famine. But he does so by basically enslaving the entire nation to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh provides food. There's this massive tax during the 7 years of plenty. And then during the 7 years of famine that follow that, the people come to Pharaoh to buy food, or they come to Joseph to buy grain. And first they give him all their money, and then they give him their land, and then they give him themselves and their labor. And so by the end of Genesis, everyone in Egypt belongs to Pharaoh. Their land belongs to Pharaoh, their bodies, their children, everyone belongs to Pharaoh. So when we turn the page to Exodus, we should recognize that everyone who lives in Egypt belongs to Pharaoh. Their labor belongs to him. He's the master. So there is a kind of servitude that includes everyone. What's different with the Israelites is the servitude is coupled with a disgust. So racism is not quite the right word yet, because race isn't a concept that's present in this time period, but in modern terms, it would be a kind of racism against the descendants of Abraham, because they're shepherds. They aren't liked. Their accent is probably different. They probably look a little bit different. People weren't bent out of shape about skin color back then, but there was a clear distinction between these people who had come from Canaan and the native Egyptians. And so they used this labor it's not just like, oh, when you work 9 to 5 and Pharaoh owns everything you produce and then he gives you a stipend. It's more like an oppressive kind of, ruthless. It says in chapter 1, they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. These are probably mud brick warehouses that are used to store up all of the things that would be needed in Pharaoh's funerary cult. So Pharaoh believed himself to be a god. He was a divine being, and that would become very clear after he died. And so every Pharaoh would build a funerary temple in his own honor, in hopes that people would continue to worship him as a deity after he died. And so probably what they're building is these kind of dome-shaped like these long dome-shaped containers that would be filled with all of the implements that they would need for worshiping Pharaoh after he died. And so that this is what they're building in Pithom and Ramses. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. And all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So there's this kind of a heaping up of words about the exploitation that's happening. Mostly they're making bricks. Mud brick was the main building material in this time in Egypt. In fact, even now, people would rather live in a mud brick house than a stone house in Egypt, because the climate is such that if your house is built of stone, it's going to be really hot in the summer and really cold in the winter. The temperature fluctuation will be, wild. Even the pharaohs lived in mud brick palaces because they wanted to be comfortable, and mud brick is the best way to regulate temperature in that region. So they were making mud bricks, which involves, pouring water on the mud, stomping in it with their feet to get little bits of straw worked in, putting the mud into molds, having the molds dry out in the sun. And as soon as a brick dries in the sun, the pieces of straw have disintegrated. There's some kind of chemical decomposition process that makes it like cement. So you can go today to Egypt and see mud bricks that date from the time of the Israelites. like they're that old and older. They've lasted that many thousands of years because they're so sturdy and because it never rains in Egypt, like ever. So you don't have to worry about erosion in the same ways that you do in other places.
Wow. So they're being oppressed, and God intervenes. And so this is where God calls Moses. And the scene is chapter 3. Moses is out as kind of acting as a shepherd, and he sees a burning bush, which is a famous image, but it's also very strange. Can you explain what's going on with this scene? What's with the bush? What happens here? Why is that important?
Okay, so Clayton, here's the deal. There's mystery involved in encountering God. So no, I can't explain the bush, but I can tell you kind of what the Bible tells us about what happened. I don't think we can wrap our minds around it, but somehow the presence of God is in this bush so that it looks like it's on fire, but it's not burning up. People have tried to say, oh, this is an acacia bush because acacia holds its shape when it's in fire, when it's in flames. Like, okay, well, fine. But the point is that it's not burning up. So I heard the most wonderful kind of analogy or interpretation of the burning bush, that it becomes an analogy for the people in Egypt, that they're under the fire of oppression, but they can't be destroyed. Like Pharaoh cannot snuff them out. And so that they survive the oppression in Egypt. And it's possible that there is a kind of symbolic resonance here with the fire that doesn't burn them up. But in any case, Moses is seeing something that's evidence of divine intervention. What he sees is not natural, which is why I don't really buy the acacia theory. Like the whole point is someone has broken in from the outside of our closed world. Like there's something supernatural happening here. And Moses is intrigued. He draws near. He takes off his sandals. God commands him to take off his sandals because he's standing on holy ground. So he's encountering the divine presence. Chapter 3 tells us that this is happening at Horeb, Mount Horeb, which is an alternate name for Sinai. It's not clear whether the mountain is Sinai and the region is Horeb, or the other way around. It seems like these are two different names for the same things, and it's possible that the name actually changes to Sinai because the bush is a sneh bush, and so maybe the mountain kind of gets named after the bush because it's like the same consonants. Anyway, he comes near and he encounters the divine presence, and God tells him, hey, I have seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I've heard their cries, and I'm going to do something about it. And this is the same Moses who tried to do something about it back in Egypt. He tried striking an oppressor, and he ends up killing an Egyptian overseer, and that gets him in big trouble. And so he has fled the scene, and now God's telling him, I have seen the oppression and I'm going to do something about it. And if I'm Moses, I'm like, sweet, because I tried and it didn't work. So great, go for it. But then God, reveals the surprise. I'm sending you, go to Pharaoh. And Moses is like, who am I? So chapters 3 and 4 are a series of objections that Moses raises to this commissioning to go back to Egypt. But God prevails upon him and he goes anyway.
Yeah, when he goes, he's got to go and confront Pharaoh, which is a big deal. I mean, if the guy thinks he's a god and he's all powerful in this country, that's not something you do lightly. So, in the course of this, God sends a series of events that are typically described as 10 plagues: flies and frogs and hail and darkness and all sorts of crazy stuff, and so it's obviously very impressive, but. What's the point of all of this? Like, why these plagues? What's going on with that?
Yeah. Okay. So one of the theories that's out there is that each one of the plagues is an attack on an Egyptian god. That there's all these different gods. So I've got here with me the complete gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt, which is like a catalog of all the deities. It's really big. They're actually categorized by type. So there's male anthropomorphic deities, female anthropomorphic deities, bovine deities, other mammal deities, avian deities, reptile and fish deities, insect deities. Like they have so many gods in Egypt that you can fill this whole catalog with them and learn about them. I am not persuaded that these particular signs are attacking particular gods. And the reason why is because in my catalog here, I've got way more types of deities than what we have plagues. And so there are whole categories like feline deities. Like there's nothing about cats in the 10 plagues, right? So I think it leaves too many Egyptian gods unaddressed. And there's overlap in, several signs would it be attacking the same one. So I don't think it's a one-to-one correspondence. Chapter 12, verse 12 says that God is attacking the gods of Egypt. So I think collectively what he's doing is bringing chaos and disorder to a land that sees itself as the place of ultimate order and harmony. Pharaoh's job is to maintain, the Egyptian word for it is ma'at. Ma'at is the Egyptian word that talks about righteousness, peace, order, justice. Like all is right in the world if it's ma'at. And Pharaoh's job is to maintain this. And God sticks his hand down into the fish tank and like messes everything up. And so creatures are not staying where they belong and things are not flourishing, they're dying instead. And so I think on a larger scale, what we're seeing is God disrupting the order of Egypt. I actually take a kind of a strange view. I'm as you said, I'm writing a commentary on Exodus. I've been working on the book of Exodus since 2011. So we're in year 13 of basically immersing myself in this book. Basically all the things I've done, almost all the things that I've done, different projects have been in Exodus in various ways. My master's thesis, my PhD dissertation, Bearing God's Name, was in Exodus. And then working on this commentary, I release weekly videos on my YouTube channel on Exodus. So Exodus is my jam. I decided not to just take the traditional way of reading these chapters and to try to come at it with more of a blank slate. So I translated from Hebrew all of, I've done the first 23 chapters now, but the chapters that are about the plagues, I was hoping to figure out what is going on here. Is there some kind of pattern? What do we need to see? And I became persuaded that we shouldn't call them plagues because only one of them is a plague. And that's the plague against the livestock is actually called a plague in Hebrew. But everything else is not called a plague. They're called signs and wonders. And as soon as you use the Bible's own language for it, signs and wonders, then you start to think, okay, well, what about the moment when Moses and Aaron go and confront Pharaoh the first time, and the staff turns into a snake, and then Pharaoh's staff turns into a snake, and Moses and Aaron's staff swallows the staff of, or the snake of Pharaoh. So isn't that a sign or a wonder? And so I began to notice there were patterns in the way each of these events were introduced and like the closure on each scene. And we have the same closure around that episode as we do around the traditional 10 plagues. And we have an additional one at the end, which is kind of the biggest sign of all. And that is the swallowing of Pharaoh's army in the Sea of Reeds. So I'm convinced that there are 12, not 10, and that we should call them the signs and wonders. So I don't know if my way of doing this will catch on, but
it does make sense because the confrontation there with the serpents always strikes you as kind of like a prologue to these other confrontations when you're reading it, but it's not in the traditional list of 10. So
right. And plague isn't how we would describe what happens in that scene. But if we're not supposed to be using that word to describe all of the things, then it opens up space for that to be the first sign. Pharaoh has said, I don't know Yahweh. In fact, in chapter 7, he says, when Pharaoh says to you, this is chapter 7, verse 9, when Pharaoh says to you, perform a miracle or perform a wonder, then say to Aaron, take your staff and throw it down. So not only has Pharaoh said, I don't know Yahweh and I don't have to listen to him, but he has also said, do a sign for me. And so all of the signs that we see, beginning with the staff into snake, are a response to Pharaoh's own request to prove that you know that you are who you are. So God isn't just coming and laying it on thick. He's actually responding to Pharaoh's own request.
Yeah.
And what I find the most striking about these signs is that they begin with something very non-threatening. Like all of the signs are amazing, but not all of them are devastating in the same way. So what you see is a gradual increase in intensity, as if God is giving warnings. Okay, I'm warning you. Look what I can do. Okay, I'm warning you even more. Okay. And each time it's like he's turning up the heat a little bit more. And Pharaoh should be saying from the beginning, okay, wow, this is outside my realm. I see you're a real deity and I have to listen to you. But Pharaoh doesn't. He continues to harden his heart, and he won't relent and respond to Yahweh. So we start with, the water turning into blood, the Nile River turning to blood. Fish die, but there's no human death. They're still able to get water by digging in the mud. They can find fresh water, and so it's a big inconvenience, but it's not actually. It doesn't cause great devastation. It just causes great consternation for a few days as they try to figure this out.
But after a while, you get the ones that are animals are dying, crops are dying, people are dying.
Right.
And,
yes,
and it escalates
eventually.
Yeah.
But notice that God doesn't start by killing people.
Yeah.
Like there's such a long gradual, and probably over many months, these signs are piling up so that Pharaoh has plenty of time to realize who he's dealing with. And he could have taken action at any point to surrender and save his nation.
Yeah.
And he chooses not to.
So let's talk about that part, because this is one of the most kind of notable things that people wrestle with. Is all of the language about God hardening Pharaoh's heart, or Pharaoh's heart being hardened and that sort of thing, and he wouldn't let the people go. And so the question is, well, if God's trying to rescue the people, why would he then harden Pharaoh's heart? And what does that even mean?
Yeah. Yes. So I'm glad you asked, because this is one of the nuts I was trying to crack as I worked on these chapters. This is probably the number one question I get asked about Exodus. How could a good God harden Pharaoh's heart and then judge him for having a hard heart?
Yeah.
It seems like God's working against Pharaoh's free will, and like God's already determined ahead of time that Pharaoh is going to be stubborn, and that's how it's going to work. So what I found interesting is that there are 3 different Hebrew words for that we translate as hardening of the heart, or his heart became hard, or it's unyielding, or whatever. I don't think hard-heartedness is the right way to translate it, because in English, when we say hard-hearted, someone is hard-hearted, they're stubborn, but also cruel. Like it has a connotation of being cruel. And in Hebrew, 2 of the 3 words for hard that get translated as hard mean to make firm. And so you can see where they got hard from that. But to be firm-hearted is not an inherently negative thing. It's to have the courage to carry out what you've determined to do. So I tell my students at Biola, if you want to graduate in 4 years, you have to have a firm heart. You have to determine you are going to show up to class, you are going to get your homework done, you are going to complete your internship, you are going to attend chapel, like you're going to do all the things expected of you. Otherwise, you won't graduate. If you're sort of lazy about it, it's not going to happen. So having a firm heart is not necessarily a bad thing. And most of the time, when the text speaks of Pharaoh's heart being made firm, Yahweh is the actor. He's the one making Pharaoh's heart firm. So he's encouraging Pharaoh to carry out what he has already freely decided to do.
Yeah.
The other word that's used with regard to Pharaoh's heart is the word to make heavy. And in English, this is hard to translate, because in English, we talk about a heavy heart when we mean sadness. You could be heavy-hearted because you're sad about something. But in a Hebrew context, a heavy heart would be a heart that's not functioning properly. And in an Egyptian context, a heavy heart has a whole nother set of connotations. So here I think it's really helpful to dig into the Egyptian Book of the Dead. This is a series of spells that were very well known in ancient Egypt during the time the Israelites were there, and long before and long after. So it has a long history. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is this customizable set of spells that someone would would commission, if they were wealthy enough, they would commission someone to make them a scroll with the spells they chose. And the spells are to help them successfully navigate the afterlife. And so if you want to make it through the underworld and have a long and happy, prosperous future in the underworld, then you need the help of these spells to sort of meet the challenges. And one of the most famous scenes in the Book of the Dead is the weighing of the heart ritual. So the dead guy is being led through the challenges, and he's led up to a set of scales, and his heart. Egyptians, as part of the embalming process, would take out key organs and put them in jars. And you can see these jars at museums and stuff. So one of the organs they took out was the heart, and they would put it in a jar. And so in this scene, what you see in the artwork is a scale. And on one side of the scale is the heart in a jar. And on the other side of the scale is a feather representing Ma'at. So we already talked about Ma'at is being this concept of balance and harmony and justice. If the heart is heavier than the feather, that means the person is guilty of injustice. And there's a little creature sitting there next to the scales. It's like got an alligator mouth and a hippo and lion body. It's like a mashup of three different animals. And his job is to gobble up the heart of anyone whose heart is heavier than Ma'at. Because that means, hey, you wreaked havoc in life. We're not going to let you live after death. We're not going to let you live in the afterworld because you haven't shown yourself to be the kind of person who's a good citizen and a good neighbor. So you have to be the kind of person who does what's right in your first life if you want to have the privilege of living on into the next life. So this is the concept around the weighing of the heart. And most of these scrolls that they've found of the Book of the Dead include this scene. So in the book of Exodus, Pharaoh is repeatedly described as making his own heart heavy. When he refuses to listen to Yahweh and do what he says, it will say, and Pharaoh made his heart heavy, which I think is just geniusly brilliant, because it's saying that judging by Pharaoh's own standards, in his own closed system of Egyptian life and the afterlife, he is disqualified from the afterlife. He is disqualifying himself by being the kind of ruler who's only thinking about his own ego and is not actually working for the flourishing of everyone who lives in his land. He's destroying and disturbing Ma'at by not cooperating with the gods. And so that is making his heart heavy, so he's guilty of injustice. God does not do this to Pharaoh. God doesn't make his heart heavy. Pharaoh's the one who makes his own heart heavy.
So let me see if I understand this. With the language that's used of God hardening Pharaoh's heart, that's the word that talks about it kind of becoming firm, right? Almost like
yes.
Strengthening your resolve.
Yes.
So Pharaoh's already headed in a direction, and God, that we've got a pastor around here who likes to say, and so God says, rock on with your bad self, right? Like it's almost like,
that is
do what you're going to do sort of thing. And on the other hand, Pharaoh hardening his heart is saying, Pharaoh made his heart unjust, made his heart guilty in their system.
Yes.
That is fascinating.
So, and part of the purpose of this showdown between Yahweh and Pharaoh is for Yahweh to demonstrate who he is, which Pharaoh has asked to know.
Yeah.
Like, who's this Yahweh? I don't know this guy. And Yahweh's like, I'm not a guy. I'm outside your system. So we actually see this with the signs and wonders with the first four: the staff into snake, the water to blood, the frogs, and then the gnats. We see, or lice. Lice is, I think, a better translation. Those first four, Pharaoh's magicians are involved, and they're able to replicate the first three of those four signs. But then when it comes to the lice, they're like, yeah, this is the finger of God. We can't do this. And so there's a sense in which they have some power, and they can wield that power in certain ways that might seem impressive. But even they are testifying to Pharaoh by number 4, okay, we've been bested. This is bigger than we are. You're dealing with you're dealing with deity here. You should back down.
Yeah.
And Pharaoh doesn't take their advice.
Yeah.
He just kind of muscles on.
All right, we've been talking a lot about the plagues, but I still have at least one more question about it's signs. I should say signs.
Signs.
So the one before you get to the sign of the Red Sea, you get Passover and the death of the firstborn children in Egypt.
Yes.
My guess is this is also a question you get a lot because it troubles anybody who's reading it without just sort of a storybook kind of version of it. If you take any, like, what are the Egyptians going through, that God would say, I'm going to kill your firstborn in each household, is just devastating. And it seems incredibly harsh. What is going on there?
Yeah. So I think the on-ramp that we've built is part of what helps me with this. And that is Pharaoh had lots of opportunities to avoid this. God doesn't start off with this. There's a long series of milder demonstrations of who Yahweh is before death is the result. Egyptian context is also helpful here, because in an Egyptian family, the firstborn son is the one who's responsible to make sure that his parents are worshipped after they die. So the firstborn son carries out all of the funerary rituals for his parents at their tomb. That's his responsibility. He takes on his father's role, like he becomes whatever his father was vocationally, career-wise, but then he's also responsible to make sure that offerings are being brought to their tomb. And the Egyptians were obsessed with death. Their tombs were so elaborate. They brought with them everything they thought they would need in the afterlife, which is one or more of everything from their life on earth. So King Tut has 132 pair of underwear in his tomb, because, like, you need your underwear, right? He's got kind of like one of everything else. So to kill for the firstborn son to die is, I want to say, it's like kicking him where it counts.
Yeah.
Because, like, if you're thinking about my whole life is oriented towards preparing for the afterlife and having a long afterlife. To take out the firstborn son is actually a direct hit on that, on your prosperity after death. So that's one piece of it that we kind of miss because we don't know the cultural context. The other thing that I think is hard for us is that we think of children as innocent. And so we think, oh, look, this is the death of innocent children. Ancient people didn't think of children as being innocent. A child was a mini version of his parents. And we see this in Jeremiah. I think it's in chapter 7, where Jeremiah talks about idolatry being a family affair. The children collect the sticks. The father builds the fire, and the mother makes the cakes for the Queen of Heaven. It's like the whole family is harnessed and oriented around the worship of false gods. So I don't think we should think of this as innocent Egyptian children are dying, but rather that God is kind of like cutting off the Egyptian worship of false gods at the knees. Like making it, it's a kind of disruption of a system that's been oriented around the worship of lots and lots of gods. Yeah. So that's one thing. And then the other piece that is helpful to me is just to recognize that the punishment fits the crime. Pharaoh, the first Pharaoh in Exodus, was killing the sons of the Hebrews by throwing them in the Nile River.
Yes. Right?
Like he's trying to undercut the Hebrews' proliferation. They're having lots of babies, and he's trying to slow that down by killing the sons of the Hebrews. And so God's like, oh yeah, I'll kill you. You're trying to kill my firstborn sons. I'm going to kill yours. So he actually says this in chapter 4 to Moses. When you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I have given you the power to do, but I will make his heart firm so that he will not let the people go. Then say to Pharaoh, this is what Yahweh says, Israel is my firstborn son. And I told you, let my son go so he may worship me, but you refuse to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of fittingness here The refusal to provide space for Israelite flourishing and to let them obey Yahweh means that they are jeopardizing. Pharaoh is jeopardizing his own family and the families of every other Egyptian. And the suffering that we see in Egypt is not because God is a mean God. It's because Pharaoh is a mean Pharaoh.
Yeah.
He is putting the lives of all of his nation at risk because he's being so stubborn against Yahweh.
What does that have to do with the Passover and the blood of the lamb on the doorpost? So this is the way people are spared from this, the killing of the firstborn. How is that connected?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on with the Passover, a lot we could talk about. One thing to say is that the lamb is not a sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice in the way that later we get sacrifices in Leviticus. The lamb is the meal that they're going to eat together. It's a dinner party. And they're supposed to gather enough people in their household that none of the food goes to waste and that they're all partaking in this same meal. So small family units would gather with other family units to have a dinner party. I was just reading in Mark Glanville's book called Improvising Church. He calls this festive kinship.
Oh, like you become family by feasting?
Yes, you become family by sharing in the feast together. And festive kinship is what we see in Deuteronomy with the different festivals. And we also see it around the table, the table of communion, right? We're eating together, and that is what makes us into a family. So God is beginning, even with this meal, to form the people into units of faithfulness. Like they're being oriented around the work of Yahweh instead of around the gods of Egypt. And he's bringing them together. So this is not individual freedom. It's collective familial freedom. So that's one piece. It's something that they can opt into, and it's not on the basis of ethnicity. So it's possible for foreigners, for Egyptians even, to participate in the Passover. And we're told in chapter 12 that when the Hebrews left, a mixed multitude went with them. These were people who had seen all the signs and wonders, and they're like, we see which God is the best God here, and we would rather be on his team. We see what's going on here, and we want to be part of this. And so actually lots of people came out of Egypt with them. And presumably that could have included Egyptians who saw, okay, Pharaoh is not the kind of leader who's righteous. Yahweh is righteous, and I'm going to follow him. So by putting the lamb's blood on the doorpost, they're signaling, they're opting in to God's deliverance. They're saying, yep, we see this, we get it, and we want to be part of this.
Yeah. So the people go free, and I'm gonna jump to kind of the second half of the book here, because this is the part where people start to get a little lost, because most of it doesn't make it into the movies, right? Like, so you get to the end of the Ten Commandments, and Charlton Heston comes down from the mountain, and the credits roll, right? So we get to Mount Sinai. And when you read Exodus, you still got half the book left, almost as if we're missing sort of the point because we only read the first half of the book. So help us understand this. This is where we get a little challenged. What is happening at Sinai, and why is that important?
Well, it's great that we've had all this time to talk about what leads up to Sinai, because so often people think of the Ten Commandments in isolation from its context. It's just like, boom, God, here's what God says you have to do, or mostly not do. And it looks like it's coming out of nowhere, but it's really important for us to recognize that we're in chapter 20 when we get the Ten Commandments. God has already done a whole lot to demonstrate who he is and to act on people's behalf and rescue them. It's to those people that he has rescued that he gives the Ten Commandments. So evangelicals today, or Christians today, often think of the law of the Old Testament as the way to get saved. Like, this is what Jews had to do to get saved. But we don't have to think about that anymore because we've got Jesus. He died for us. And so we can just kind of set that aside. But no self-respecting Jew would tell you that the law is how they get saved. God saves by his grace. That is what we see in the first half of Exodus. God is rescuing people who aren't like particularly qualified. There's no audit of their morality before they leave. Moses doesn't say, okay, I'm going to check into your history and find out if you've been worshiping idols. He just says all they have to do is have this dinner party and put the blood on the doorposts and they're out. And so the law is not how they get saved. The law is how they will fulfill their mission as God's people now that they have been saved. So they arrive at Mount Sinai. God tells them, here's what it's going to mean to be part of my nation instead of Pharaoh's nation. This is what my society is going to look like. And he sets up laws that are righteous and good and that will regulate and prevent exploitation of the vulnerable in the community. And he gives them their new vocation as his people. So my favorite passage in the whole book is in chapter 19. And I wrote my master's thesis on this one at Gordon Conwell. So in chapter 19, verse 4, the first thing he says to them when they arrive at Sinai is, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations, you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So there's 3 titles there that are super important: the treasured possession, kingdom of priests, holy nation. That phrase treasured possession is a technical term in Hebrew that refers to a treaty partner.
Huh.
They are God's segula. They have entered into a treaty with him, and he has appointed them to be his representatives among the nations. And the law is how they're going to do that. The law is the way that they will carry out that new vocation.
So this is a way of saying, all right, now I've rescued you. I made you my people. Let me describe to you the way of life you're going to have if you're going to carry out he's not just rescuing them to rescue them. He's rescuing them to make something of them and use them in some way. This is how he's going to do it, by you living in this way.
Yes, exactly. And that then changes the way Christians relate to it.
Yeah.
Because if this is a matter of mission rather than salvation, then the way that we're saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ doesn't actually touch that part.
Yeah.
It's like that Jesus' salvation for us and the forgiveness of sin is the equivalent of us being rescued from slavery in Egypt. And now we stand at the mountain with the people of God, ready for our marching orders. And our commission is similar to their commission. We're supposed to be a light to the nations. So what does that look like? Well, at the very least, like sort of the starting platform is you're going to be a kind of people who loves God and loves others. You're going to be characterized in particular ways so that you can carry this out.
So give us some tips about how to understand this. So it's one thing to say conceptually, okay, we're standing there at the mountain and these, the law, the description of what it means to be God's people is relevant to us. Mm-hmm. And yet, for several reasons, there are things in the actual laws that feel very inaccessible. Some of it's cultural, I don't have a donkey, so what are these laws about donkeys?
And your neighbor doesn't have an ox.
And my neighbor doesn't have an ox, right? So, okay. And then there's also things that seem to be related to things that changed after Jesus, right? Things that are related to ceremonial type things and that sort of thing. Give us some guidelines, some tips on how those of us on this side of things can relate to that.
Yeah, so let me first say that I just released a free course with Admirato that it's about 2 hours worth of content or so, where I kind of walk through in more detail how Christians should relate to Old Testament law. So you can find that online, freely available online. I'll say just in kind of a summary fashion that I think what we're supposed to do with the law is recognize the principle behind the law by taking into consideration its cultural context. And then we should translate that for our context today, not in a sort of fixed way, not as if to say everything we need to know is right here in this law, because we are in very different times, but there's so much relevance of Old Testament laws in the way that they teach us about about how to care for others, about how to take responsibility for ourselves, about how to look out for those around us. And all of that gives us a window into God's character. And I think we miss this because we just sort of gloss over the laws and we think, oh, this doesn't relate to me. I remember a time back when I was in college, my husband and I had just gotten married. We were living in some apartments across the street from our university. And one of our neighbors was out grilling in the back of his apartment. And I was out, and I think our niece was over, and I was watching her, and she was playing in the open area. And so we struck up a conversation, and he found out that we were students at the Bible college. And he was like, oh, I wish there was a .com Bible. I wish we could just know, like in the age of the internet, and like there's just not rules about this the same way as there were rules in ancient times. So like we're missing out on all this stuff. And I was like, well, it just so happened that week I had been reading through Exodus, and I came to the laws about the goring ox, the ox that gores and how you shall deal with it. Now, I don't have an ox. No one I know has an ox. And so this might seem very irrelevant, but that week it was big in the news in Portland that somebody who had a Doberman Pinscher or a pit bull, it might have been a pit bull, someone's dog had mauled a child and disfigured them terribly. And then it became known that this had happened before, that this dog had previously mauled a person. And then I'm like, okay, the Bible's got lots to say to us about this, because in Exodus, if an ox gores someone, you put the ox to death and the owner is not held responsible. But if an ox is known to be a gorer and he has not been put to death or penned up, or his in Hammurabi's version of the law, his horns could be blunted to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So there are ways to make sure the ox doesn't do this again. But the main point is, if it's happened before and then it happens again, now the owner is responsible. Now the owner is subject to the death penalty because he has treated his neighbors' lives so lightly so as to not try to protect them from the animal that is his responsibility. So nobody can be held responsible for a first offense. But if it happens again, you knew better. And that's serious. So that's one way to apply the law. We, as a family, have just kind of gone through another layer, another level of thinking about that, because my dad was just diagnosed with dementia, and the neurologist doesn't want him driving anymore. And he got in a wreck right as we were sort of figuring out, okay, how much longer can he keep driving? He was driving a truck, his friend's truck, and turned from the wrong lane onto another road, turned left in front of oncoming traffic from the wrong lane, and got hit. No one was hurt. And he was trying to make the case like it's okay for him to keep driving.
Yeah.
And I'm like, but Dad, we have a diagnosis now. And you've been in a wreck before. So now if it happens again and someone is seriously injured, they're going to look back at the record and say, you knew the doctor told you it wasn't safe to drive. You knew that it wasn't safe because look, there was another accident. It's now your responsibility to protect other drivers on the road by taking away the keys. So I feel like there's actually so much in Old Testament law that is relevant to the situations that we are facing today.
Yeah. It seems to me, as you're describing that it takes a little bit of imagination and creativity to that, right? Like,
it does.
You don't have an ox, so it seems not immediately applicable.
Yeah.
But to make the jump, okay, so the dog feels a little bit like the ox because it's an animal, right? But then the principle applying, saying, if I know that there's something that I might be putting someone in danger, namely my father who's not able to drive well anymore.
Yeah.
That's it takes a little bit of pondering imagination on that. I would imagine that these are the sorts of things that as we read through them one time, you may say, oh, I wonder what that has to do with it. My guess is that the meditation on these over the course of time, coming back to them, you start to put those pieces together.
Totally. I mean, and isn't this exactly what Paul does? You shall not muzzle an ox while it's treading the grain. Okay, so now you all understand what you need to do. Pay your pastors.
Yeah.
And so Paul is using exactly this kind of analogical reasoning. If God is concerned about oxen, as they're working, that they should have a share in the fruits of their labor, then how much more people should have a share in, so Paul is doing exactly this kind of reasoning, and it does require imagination. How did he even think of that?
Yeah.
But the more you immerse yourselves in the law at Sinai, the more you begin to see these connections, and they just sort of emerge.
Yeah. Let me ask specifically about the Ten Commandments, because that's the one that's obviously most famous. They feel the most timeless in many respects. And sometimes people will say, well, this is sort of either the summary or kind of the big ones, and the rest we can ignore, whatever. How do we take the Ten Commandments? Where does it fit in this? Why start with those?
Sure. So I wouldn't call them a summary, because there are lots of laws that get left out of them. Like there's lots of things that don't seem to fit, but I do think of them as kind of the seed of the rest. Like it grows and develops as these concepts are applied in more and more situations. So Jesus is, I think, right when he summarizes all of the law in just 2 commands: love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. I think loyalty to God and loyalty to neighbor is how we fulfill these commands, all of them, because all of them are concerned with proper worship and proper love of neighbor. And so if you're really focusing on love of God and neighbor, you will do all of these things naturally. You won't be stealing your neighbor's sheep or his Tesla or whatever, right? Like you'll be taking responsibility for the things that you borrow So I think of them in part as a seed. They're the commands that get inscribed on stone, and that is a symbol of the people having entered into a covenant or treaty with Yahweh. So every ancient Near Eastern treaty they made 2 stone tablets with the stipulations of the treaty on it, so that each party could take one of the stone tablets and deposit it in the temple of their deity, so that their deity could kind of look over and make sure that it was all being obeyed. So when Moses comes down from the mountain with 2 tablets, it would have been very clear, obviously, to all the adults, oh, we're in a treaty now with Yahweh. We've just entered in. And he's called us his Segala, which is a treaty partner, so we saw this coming.
Yeah. So it's not the first 5 are on one tablet, the next 5 are on the next. It's duplicate copies to say, here's your agreement, my agreement. Yes. We both got the contract in a sense.
Yes. And front and back. So I don't know if you saw this in the news, but this week, somebody talked about there's the oldest stone copy of the 10 Commandments is up for sale. And they think it might bring in a couple $1 million. It dates long after the New Testament. It's like 300 to 600 AD, but it's this big piece of stone. And it's really curious because it's written in Proto-Semitic language, which is like pre-Hebrew. It would have been the language of the 10 Commandments. Like if Moses, the tablets that Moses brought down would not have looked like Hebrew. Like if you opened up a Hebrew Bible today, it wouldn't have been that script, because that script hadn't been developed yet. It would have been Proto-Semitic. So it's really fascinating to me that someone has this in Proto-Semitic 300 AD.
Yeah.
It seems like they must be, they're trying to be authentically, making it like the original. But the problem with this thing is that it's so big and it's all on one side. You can read all the 10 Commandments on one side of it. And they're trying to say that apparently the rabbi said this was the right dimension of the stone, but this stone weighs over 100 pounds. And I'm like, he had 2. They were written on front and back.
How do you do this?
And they have to fit in the Ark of the Covenant. Yeah. Which is, the dimensions are based on the cubit. I'm a little skeptical about that being realistic. But anyway,
yeah. Well, let's. You mentioned the Ark of the Covenant, so I want to talk about kind of the last chunk of Exodus has 2 things. One's a story and one is some instructions, and both of them are a little challenging. So let's start with the story. While Moses is on the mountain, the people are at the foot of the mountain, and over the course of time, they say, "Where's Moses gone?" And somehow they get it in their mind that they are going to make a god for themselves, and they make a golden calf and begin to worship it. What is going on there?
Yes. So I've already held up my my complete gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
I think it's worth noting that one of the categories of deity is for the Egyptians is bovine deities.
Yeah.
So there's an Apis. Apis is a bull with a sun disk on his head. You see it all over the place. There's actually on the next page, I think there's a picture of a stela. This one's black and white, so you can't tell, but I actually have a photograph of it that I took in the Cairo Museum.
Yeah.
This cow is golden, like it's painted gold. So I think it's very reasonable that the people are thinking like, we want a god like the gods of Egypt that we can see. How shall we make it? Well, there are cow gods everywhere. Like there's bulls or calves used to represent deities in Egypt. This is also true, of course, in Canaan. Baal is a bull, and it's also true in Mesopotamia. So across the ancient world, bulls are strong. They signify kind of almost superhuman strength. They can do what humans can't do in terms of pulling loads and carrying whatever. So I think that it's a natural way for people to think we want something bigger and stronger than we are to represent us. It's of course tragic because when God makes humanity in Genesis 1, he appoints humanity as his image, which is the word for idol. Humans are supposed to be the physical representatives of the presence of God. And the people are trading away that position to a metal object. And so, and not to mention that God has just said, don't make any images of me. And he doesn't say this here, but I love how the way Tim Mackey says this in the Bible Project video on the image of God. He's like, God tells them not to make any images of him because he's already made images of himself, and it's them. So there's a logic, a theological logic to the prohibition of images, and the people are not only demoting God by trying to put him in the form of a calf, but they're demoting themselves as the people who are supposed to represent him. It's all wrong.
Yeah. So they're doing this, and in the meantime, Moses is getting instructions, and he's getting instructions specifically about the right way to approach and worship God, which is through this tabernacle. Now, this is the part of the book that I think most people find the most challenging to read because it's so dull. It's a lot of detail, and it happens twice. So it's the instructions on how to build it, and then the description of them actually doing the things.
Right.
But it takes up a lot of real estate. And so it seems like it's important because of that. Why should this matter to us, especially those of us who, after Jesus, we're not going to be building or using a tabernacle, but we're reading it in our Bible reading plan? What do we do with this?
Well, first of all, the New Testament authors make a lot out of the temple and the tabernacle, especially the author of Hebrews spends a lot of time on the symbolic value of each part of it and what it can point to with Jesus. So even just like a Jesus-centered approach, we need the tabernacle because it explains his ministry. But you're right that it takes up a lot of real estate. And I am I've been recently thinking about this because I was in Egypt in January of 2024. And I had a chance to go into lots of different temples and tombs. And what I saw on the walls of these temples and tombs were parades of people bringing elements for worship, like bringing offerings, and parades of images that showed that Pharaoh had defeated his enemies, that sort of thing. So there's this monumental discourse, and I mean that in the technical sense, like these are monuments that are talking about history. And Israel doesn't have monuments like this. in this time period. What they have is a text. And the text, I think, actually imitates the monumental history that it's coming from.
Huh.
This is their way of having a transportable monument in the desert, is to have this elaborate description of here's what God wants us to build, so that as you're reading it, you can sort of build it in your imagination. Even today, even though we don't have the tabernacle, it takes up so much real estate in the text because we're supposed to see how important it is.
Yeah.
The Israelites do not show up at Sinai, have a quick encounter with Yahweh, and then he's like, bye-bye, have a nice life. He actually decides to come with them. And because God moves into the neighborhood, to put it in your words,
Yeah.
it's a big deal. Like to craft the tent he's going to live in a time when they're all living in tents.
Yeah.
Now God's going to live in a tent among our tents. He's coming to dwell among us. This is huge news, and he's going forward. So John chapter 1 talks about Jesus, the Word becoming flesh and tabernacling among us, or making his tent among us. And that's reflecting the same idea, that the significance of the presence of God coming among his people and leaving Sinai. Sinai is not a place where they go on pilgrimage every time they want to have an encounter with God. They don't, because they have God with them.
Yeah.
And they don't need to go to Sinai. So that's one thing, that kind of the theological piece. There's another piece that I think is so fascinating, and I'm going to show those who are watching online can see. This is from an essay in the book, Did I Not Bring Israel Out of Egypt?, edited by Jim Hoffmeyer, who led our Egypt trip in January. And this article by Joshua Berman shows the dimensions of the tabernacle match the dimensions of Pharaoh's war tent.
No.
Which I think is so cool. So
Whoa,
the image on
cool.
the top is Pharaoh's war tent. And it's the battle compound of Ramses II. And there is a battle. The Battle of Kadesh is it's actually the most trumpeted battle, the most recorded battle in history. It's on multiple monuments in Egypt that kind of showing his war tent and showing the battle. Pharaoh was very, very proud of this victory. And the biblical account of the drowning at the sea of Pharaoh's army and the building of the tent actually mimics many elements, not just the dimensions, but many elements of Pharaoh's own famous and favorite battle that he won. And so it's like God is co-opting. Yeah, it's so fun. It's like God is co-opting Pharaoh's his greatest hits of his time as Pharaoh. He's like, hey, I've got you here.
Oh my gosh. It's one final blow. Like, you think, like, the first half of the book, we dealt with Pharaoh. It's almost like one last insult there at the end.
It is.
Oh my gosh.
And here's the thing. When I was in Egypt, I was at the point in my commentary where I had just left Egypt and was crossing the wilderness, right? So I just finished the Red Sea, and I was like, oh, perfect. So I'm going to go to Egypt, and I'm going to see all the stuff that happened in the first half of the book, and it'll be relevant for that. What shocked me, and it was really great. What shocked me was how much relevant there was for the second half of the book. The tabernacle design has so many Egyptian elements to it. The Ark of the Covenant looks just like the ark that the people carry around. So there's one found in King Tut's tomb with Anubis, the god of the underworld, the jackal god, sitting on top of it. And it's like a box with carrying poles, and the priests would carry it and parade him through the town. And it looks just like the Ark of the Covenant, the same concept. And you see these all over the place in Egyptian temples, just, carved into the walls of the temple and described. Winged creatures like the cherubim there's always winged protectors around the deity in all of the Egyptian art. And so I found so many things that resonate with the tabernacle. And I think what's happening here is God is saying, look, I am your new God. You are to follow me. And he's using symbols and forms that would have been familiar to the Hebrews because of their hundreds of years in Egypt. And he's communicating to them in a way they can understand. Like, I am replacing that thing that you knew of in Egypt. This is the new reality now.
Yeah. If you've got people who have always existed in one thing and you're
Mm-hmm.
expecting that any of the things to stick, right? You've got to do
Yeah.
something that shows them, okay, this is the new order of things. That's really incredible. That's very fascinating. Well, I've got, all sorts of more things that I'm curious about, but we probably should wrap up here. Let me end with just a practical thing here. So when we talk on Bible Savvy, we're always talking about not just understanding and enjoying the Bible, but also applying it. And so we want to respond. We don't want to just be people who hear the word. We want to be people who do the word. So what are some of your tips for applying the message of Exodus in our lives?
I think one of the best tips actually comes from the book of Exodus, from the early chapters. Before Yahweh says anything, we have a handful of women who are acting in ways that are defiant to Pharaoh. The midwives defy him. The daughter of Pharaoh defies him by rescuing this Hebrew baby. The baby's mother defies Pharaoh by putting him in the river, but he's in a basket that will save him. And his sister stands guard and watches and arranges for his mom to nurse him. So what I find really fascinating about these opening chapters is that the same verbs that are used to describe the action of these women are the verbs that are used to describe God's action when he later says, like, I have seen the people, I have heard their cries, and I have come down to rescue them. What we're hearing is echoes of the daughter of Pharaoh who saw Moses crying, who saw him in the basket, who heard his cries, and who took pity on him. There's the same reflex. And so before Yahweh even shows up, we have women who are demonstrating what it looks like to live out the message of the book. And that is, don't live in fear of man. Don't live as if Pharaoh is boss. Live as if Yahweh is boss. And do the things that you know will please him. It's not right to put these children to death. So do what you can, save who you can.
Yeah.
And I think what we see kind of side by side in the opening chapters is women who do the work of God and Moses who does the work of God. Moses has a very obvious commission, the dramatic burning bush and the voice that tells him exactly what to do. And they have this whole dialogue, and that's really cool. And some of us may have a sense of calling from God that has a sort of supernatural element to it, and that's great. But I think for most of us, we're not going to have a burning bush, but we're going to look out on the world and we're going to see work that needs to be done. And I think the opening chapters encourage us to get busy and do it. Don't wait for the divine voice to tell you to do it. If you see something that's wrong, do something about it. If you see something in the world, someone in the world who needs rescuing, rescue them. Don't wait for someone to tap you on the shoulder and say, this one's for you. Just do it if it's the right thing.
Yeah. I love that.
And we see that, of course, in the laws. As I already mentioned, the laws remind them, hey, you were slaves in Egypt. Don't be like that. Be the kind of people who are so kind to others that they see you're different. And maybe I'll just read my favorite law in that regard. Exodus 22:21, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry, just like I heard your cry.
Yeah.
I heard your cry. So if you make someone cry out, I'm going to hear their cry too. And then you're going to be on the wrong end of things, just like Pharaoh was on the wrong end of things. So there's a very strong word here for us to look out for our neighbor, to love our neighbor. And I think, we can spend the rest of our lives living that out.
I love that. That is so good. Well, Dr. Imes, thank you so much for spending some time with us. Before we finish up, can you tell us where we can find you online, where we'd find your resources?
Sure. I am on Facebook. I'm on X. I'm on Blue Sky as of a few weeks ago. I have a blog. I write for Christianity Today. If you just Google my name, Carmen Joy Imes, lots of stuff will come up. Probably the most fun place to follow me would be YouTube. I have a YouTube channel where I release videos every Tuesday called Torah Tuesday, and I'm working through the book of Exodus little by little. It's taken me 4 years to do the first 20 chapters. And so if you're wanting more detailed insights, that's a good place to go. You already mentioned my course for the Bible Project, and I mentioned the one for Admirado. So there's lots of ways to learn with me online.
Yeah, it's well worth it. Those of you who are listening or watching, I recommend all of those things. Torah Tuesdays is really fun. So as you're reading through Exodus, if there's something you're saying, I really wonder about that, go and check and see if she's done a video about it, because there's a lot of good insight in there. Just as a reminder to all of you, if you want to win some of Dr. Imes' books, just subscribe to the Bible Savvy YouTube channel. Leave a comment with your favorite insight from this interview. We'll be picking winners when we get to the end of the book of Exodus in 5 weeks or so. For all of you out there, hopefully this has been really helpful for you. Over the next month on the Bible Savvy podcast, we are going to be discussing individual passages from the book of Exodus, so tune in each Monday for that. Make sure you subscribe to either the podcast or the YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next Monday.
Thanks for hanging out with us. Join us again next Monday for a new episode where we'll be looking at another passage from the Bible Savvy reading schedule. And in the meantime, if you're not following along with the reading plan, check out BibleSavvy.com. Also, you can subscribe and leave a review on whatever platform you're listening or watching on. You can find us on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Email us your questions or suggestions at podcast@BibleSavvy.com. Lastly, tell your friends, and we'll talk to you next week.